the rational mind. So how do we come to know God? We come to know God best in proper Augustinian fashion by reflecting on that which we know that is closest to God, most like God, and that is the rational mind. And so we see God in a mirror in the sense that we look at the rational mind, the nearest thing to God, and discern from that what God is like. Now, how does this get us to moral theory? Well, like this. What we see when we look at the rational mind and we note its likeness to God and its utility as a way of getting to know God and the Trinitarian structure of the rational mind to which Augustine draws our attention, what we realize is that we were made not just capable of knowing God, but we were made for the purpose of knowing God. And because this is our purpose, and because knowing God is the highest and best thing that we can do, it is also that which we ought preeminently to will, as Anselm puts it. So because the rational mind is a mirror for God, and because knowledge of God is the highest knowledge there is, what we most ought to do is aim all our power, all our effort, as he says, at remembering, understanding, knowing, and willing, loving God. And so we fulfill our purpose when we do that. This is St. Jerome, but he looks contemplative. So he says in Monologion 68, after this long reflection about how the rational mind serves as a mirror, it is clear that the rational creature ought to devote all its power and will to remembering and understanding and loving the supreme good, for which purpose it knows it has its very existence. It's important for Anselm, and this will come up again, that the power of rationality just is the power to discern the just, and I'm quoting, the just from what is not just, the true from what is not true, the good from what is not good, and the greater good from the lesser good. Given that rationality just is that, its purpose then is to enable us to do this. To fulfill our purpose, well, is to do that. And we do that most and best when we love God above all things. So summarizing this part, the fulfilling our purpose part, the theological reflections lead us into a certain epistemological conundrum. How do we know this God? We know this God by examining the rational mind, which is the nearest thing to God, the mirror in which we see the nature of God. In examining that, we discover our purpose, which simply is to know God, preeminently by examining the rational mind and inferring the nature of God from that, and loving God, because knowledge is really not so interesting unless you put it to proper use. And so rectitude, to go back to our key concept, if rectitude is doing what we ought to do, and what we ought to do is fulfill our purpose by knowing and loving God above all things, rectitude consists in fulfilling our purpose in that way. That's one route to understanding what rectitude is for Anselm. It's not the one in which he puts the most energy or to which he devotes the most attention, though it's the one that perhaps appeals to philosophers and theologians the most. The one that he's really, really interested in is the second one, finding our place. This is Christ as architect of the world. I think this is an excellent image for what Anselm is after. What God does in creation is establish a certain order. That order has beauty and fittingness. And our job as rational creatures who can maintain that fittingness knowingly and willingly is simply to do that, to discover our place in God's creation, to discover God's will for us in this beautiful and fitting order that he has established, and by our wills associate ourselves with God's ordering in that way. You can imagine that when Anselm thinks about, what sort of world would God create, one of the first things he says is a good world, of course, and beauty is a good, and beauty consists in order. I think that's the reasoning that he goes through behind the scenes. And he uses those kinds of reflections, as many of you no doubt know, in Cur Deus Homo quite often, where the argument is basically, look, God has to do it this way. Why? Not because any necessity is imposed upon God, not because there's something sort of driving him to do it or something constraining him from doing otherwise, but just because God must do what is beautiful and orderly. God cannot leave anything disordered in his kingdom. And X, which always turns out to be something about incarnation and atonement, is necessary, in ways that Anselm will explain, for God to maintain that fitting order. So here's an example from Book 1, Chapter 15. Why must God insist upon recompense? Why must God punish those for whom recompense is not made? Well, because it would be ugly. It would be unseemly if he didn't do that. If divine wisdom did not add recompense and punishment wherever perversity tries to disturb correct order, tries to, by the way, because you never actually can. God's order is always perfect. A certain ugliness would arise from the violation of the beauty of order in the very universe that God ought to make orderly, and God would seem to fall short in his governance. And this notion of order and beauty in Anselm really is an important theme. Lots of people have commented on it, and it pops up in the oddest sorts of ways. There's a wonderful moment fairly early on in Cur Deus Homo where the delightfully named Bozo frets that unbelievers regard Christian teaching on the atonement as nothing more than beautiful pictures. And part of the response from Anselm is, in effect, the beauty of those pictures is their cogency. You're making a false distinction here between sort of literary merit almost, or aesthetic value and logical cogency. The beauty of those pictures is their cogency. Well, this notion of order plays a role in theoretical reflections, but it also plays a very important role in Anselm's practical advice. From his earliest letters through his latest, we find one constant refrain. We must maintain the beauty of divine order by submitting our wills to God's. And a big part of what it is to submit our wills to God's is to submit our wills to the earthly authorities that God has put over us. When an earthly authority, for example, exacts vengeance or inflicts punishment, it does that as an agent of God, and to be subject to that punishment is to be subject to God's will. So maintaining the beauty of order will require that we conform our will not only to God's will, but to the will of our superiors. Now, particularly in the early letters, where Anselm is writing almost exclusively to monks, you can sort of see how this works. And there's a wonderful letter to Eulalia, abbess of Shaftesbury, in which he explains what true obedience is. And this is his take on it. There is true obedience when the will of the subordinate obeys the will of the superior in such a way that no matter where the subordinate is, she wills what she knows her superior wills, provided that it is not contrary to the will of God. Now, we'll have to come back later to that very important proviso, provided that it is not contrary to the will of God's, and figure out how we're supposed to know when it is that our superiors are telling us to do something that is contrary to God's will. But for now, the important point is that these considerations of order and obedience play an astoundingly large role in Anselm's practical advice. Well, if the advice you give to those under authority is to maintain authority, to obey authority, the advice that you give to those who are in authority is going to be to exercise that authority. One of the many reasons that Anselm made an absolutely disastrous administrator, and he did make an absolutely disastrous administrator, was that he said things like this: nothing that can be corrected is beneath your attention. Think of that as a moment to a piece of advice to a department chair, a dean, a provost, a president. It's only going to lead to disaster, but it gives you an idea of what Anselm was saying. But before we get to the King of Ireland, there's some interesting advice to some monks at Christ Church, Canterbury. He hears that there is factionalism and insubordination running rampant among the monks, and he sternly insists, quote, everyone should be subject in humble generosity and generous meekness to the prior. It was never my will, and with God's protection it never will be my will, that such great and reprehensible disorder should arise in the church commended to my rule, or should it ever arise, that it be encouraged or permitted. Nothing that can be corrected is beneath your attention. Well, that's from this letter to King Murtagh of Ireland. And here's a longer quotation from it. I beseech, to give you an idea of just how far and how seriously Anselm took this, I beseech the constancy of your goodwill, insofar as you find things in your kingdom in need of correction, to strive earnestly with God's help to set them right, for the sake of the eternal reward, and so that God's grace may increase in you more and more. Nothing that can be corrected is beneath your attention. God holds all people, listen to this, God holds all people accountable not only for what they do wrong, but also for the wrongs that they can correct, but fail to correct. And the more power they have for correcting them, the more stringently God holds them accountable for willing and acting well, in accordance with the power that was mercifully bestowed upon them. This seems to apply above all to kings, since they are recognized among human beings as having greater power and facing less opposition. Now, a slight sort of concession to reality. Now, if you cannot correct all wrongs at once, that is no reason for you not to strive to progress from better things to even better things. You don't, in Anselm's view, go from good to better. You go from better to better still. For God in his kindness usually brings good intentions and good efforts to fulfillment, and he repays them with blessed abundance. So here we have Anselm's picture. I think it's a very Benedictine picture, with God as the wise and kindly abbot of a vast but perfectly regulated network of monasteries. But it is not clear that the theory offers much practical guidance for regulating the unruly wills and affections of sinners, even in the relative tranquility that prevails inside the walls of the monastery, let alone in the far more tempestuous affairs of secular life. The shortcomings of Anselm's morality of obedience are evident throughout his letters. Again, one noticeable deficiency is that Anselm tends to encourage a kind of passivity. He is quick to absolve someone of moral responsibility so long as that person is obeying a superior. And we see this in this early letter to Hugh the Prior, one of the first letters we have. Hugh was at odds with his superior. He didn't think his superior was running things properly. We don't really know the exact nature of the dispute. But the superior refused to listen to Hugh's, no doubt, wise advice. And Hugh writes to Anselm and says, Father Anselm, basically give me permission to step down from this. This is miserable. I can't work with this guy. This guy's a jerk. He's not doing things right. Let me go. And he writes to him, look, you can't step down without consent, because that would be an act of disobedience. If you can't get the consent, then you just have to keep quiet, obey your superior, and trust that your superior and not you will be held responsible for any mismanagement. And here is our quotation from that letter. Since the chief position in this endeavor was entrusted to him, not to you, you will not be held responsible if the flock is ill-governed, because the shepherd failed to heed your advice.